So, welcome to The Death of Retirement, New Thinking on the Next Chapter. My name is Rami Becker, and I am the Editorial and Public Relations Manager at Savant. And I'm very excited today to introduce you to our two guests because they've both been involved in our research project on the topic of retirement and how it's actually evolving here in the US. So, first, I'd like to welcome Rob Morrison. He is Savant's Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer. Rob is a certified financial planner professional. He's also a co-author of Victory Lap Retirement, Work While You Play, Play While You Work. And he's also a contributor to this book, which is Retirement Heaven or Hell, Which Will You Choose? So, Rob, I know this topic is near and dear to your heart, so I can't wait to dig in on the research with you and talk about it.
Delighted to be here as well. Rami, thanks for hosting this and be here with you and Julie and everybody that's joining us today. It's certainly a subject of passion for me and excited to share some of the results from this study.
Great. And next, I'd like to introduce you all to Julie Littlechild. She's the founder and CEO of Absolute Engagement. Julie is also an author with a book called The Pursuit of Absolute Engagement. Now, Savant partnered with Absolute Engagement to survey 750 high net worth investors, not our clients, by the way, to get a sense of what may be changing about retirement as we know it. So welcome, Julie.
Thanks so much. Real pleasure to be here today.
Great. Well, let's just start off and dig into those research findings. And Julie, your team came away with 6 kind of major insights from that. Would you like to give us an overview?
Yeah, absolutely. It might be helpful to just provide that overarching view of what we learned. And then I'm just looking forward to talking to Rob about the findings. And I think that'll be the key part of this. And just as a quick reminder, you just mentioned a couple of these things, but we did talk to 750 investors. And it's important to note, I think, that everyone that we talk to does work with a financial advisor. You mentioned it's not Savant's clients, but they either make or contribute to the financial decisions in the household. And I think, therefore, had an opinion on how they're thinking about retirement going forward. We were almost equally split between men and women with a wide age range. And I'll talk about some of the differences that we saw between the different age segments and gender. Now, there's a fair bit of data that we'll go through. I'll put some of those things on the screen to support these 6 insights that we built. I'll really just touch on them quite briefly and try to highlight some of the key points in that slide. So don't worry too much. You don't need to take in every key piece of that slide. I'll just try to make it as easy as possible. But as Rami mentioned, we did identify 6 key insights that we thought were really quite interesting, worthy of conversation, worthy of further examination. You see those here, but let me just talk about each of those separately for a moment. And it really starts with this idea that our vision of retirement is changing going forward. You know, I think the textbook definition of retirement is simply that you stop working. You get to a point in your life and stop working entirely. Well, just over half of the folks that we talked to said that that was the case. 54% agreed that that currently, at least, is their path forward, which meant that almost half didn't see that as the path. So about 30% said, you know, I'm going to work full time, but then I want to transition more to some part-time work, or perhaps work on my own terms, do something different before I stop working completely. And about 16% said they wanted to move more to unpaid or volunteer work before they stopped working completely. And I guess, you know, one of the questions that we asked is, why wouldn't you, stop earlier or try something new? And for some people, there is always concern about finances. Will I have enough? Will I be okay? But there were actually some more nuanced differences that came out. And there were some quite interesting, I thought, differences between men and women, for example. Men were more likely to say it could be difficult to think about maybe transitioning to something completely new. Women were often quite concerned with some practical things like, would I lose health insurance? Either way, there was a lot of questions that came up, but we did see that the vision is clearly changing. And so we dug into that a little bit to really understand, the fact that people are on a path, and they might say, this is my path currently, but we were wondering, if it was an option to do things differently, would you? And the answer was a resounding yes. You see here, 69% of people that we talked to said if they believed it was an option to transition to a different type of work or to something completely different, they would. So there was a keen interest in perhaps thinking about different options when it came to retirement. I don't think it was very surprising, but the younger the client, our youngest segment was under 45, they were even more likely to say that they would be very open to perhaps taking a different path. So, all in all, the vision for retirement is changing. We could see that really quite clearly. And I would just describe the folks that we talk to as just being more open to a very different vision of what that might look like. Now, the second insight was that we were gathering this data in a certain context that we all know, and that's the pandemic. And the pandemic did certainly contribute to how people thought about their plans in retirement. So about a third of the clients we talked to said that their plans for retirement had changed in some way. Now, when you start to break that down, in some cases, they said, I might need to work a little longer, or I'm considering working longer. That was actually more so the case with our male respondents. But there was another interesting outcome, and that was people thinking about how they wanted to spend their time in retirement. So down one path was maybe I need to work a little longer, but not for everyone. And the other was it's becoming really important to me to think about what time looks like. So we did see some very big differences here based on age. So when we started to break that down, what you see here is the younger clients were more likely to say that they planned on working a little longer time frame. But when you start to look at the individuals that we would typically consider that pre-retirement age, the 55 to 64, they were actually much less likely to say that they would work longer. Their plans were set, they were moving forward, but real age disparity there. But what we also see, just to reinforce a point I just made, was that nearly a third said the way that I want to spend my time in retirement has changed. So that was also an important consideration. Let's move quickly to the third insight that we saw then. And this idea that planning for a transition to retirement, when we're thinking about that transition, the idea of meaning and purpose is incredibly critical. And one of the things that really brought this to light was this idea of a false start retirement. I thought this was really quite compelling. Almost 20% of the individuals that we talked to said they had experienced a false start retirement. They retired and then they went back to work. And so we wanted to understand why that was the case. And it turns out it wasn't about the money. In fact, a very small percentage said, I couldn't afford the lifestyle I wanted. What they did tell us is what you see here. 36% saying, I'm financially ready, but I might not be personally ready, or I'm just having a hard time moving on from full-time work. I didn't feel fulfilled. I didn't know how to fill my time. There was a whole range of issues that emerged as people started that. And so I think it really does reinforce this idea that we need to be clear on what our purpose will be and how life will look after retirement. There were some differences when we started to break this down by gender. So for example, women were more likely to say, I found it hard to move on, or I couldn't fill my time. Men were more likely to say there was maybe a lack of purpose, a lack of clarity on who I am outside working full time, and even a few who pointed to the fact that it can put strains on relationships. So the responses were almost as varied as the people in the survey, but you certainly saw some clear trends. The good news is I think we can do something about a lot of this. And there were concerns, and that also became very clear. Just to give you one example, we provided respondents with a variety of different concerns, and you see here that 27% said, I worry about whether I'll feel fulfilled in retirement, but another 28% said, it's not a concern now, but it probably will be in future. So when you put those together, almost 60% of respondents saying this sense of fulfillment is on my mind. It's a real concern for me as I start to think about the next phase. Now, you know, a lot of the extent to which people are thinking about fulfillment, I think, comes back to the idea of whether they have a clear plan. And so we did ask, how clear are you about how you want to spend your time in retirement? Basically, about 60% of respondents said they weren't fully clear. So 40%, as you see here, were very clear, which meant everybody else was somewhere else on that path. And I think that led to some of those concerns about fulfillment. Now, having said that, what we did see is that overall, the words that people used were really quite optimistic. You know, they talked about being hopeful as they thought about what life would be like in retirement. Hopeful, relaxing, optimistic, excited. And in particular, we could see a connection between being clear about what life would look like, these more optimistic views. And when the client said, I'm clear about my future, they were also often talking about things like travel, hobbies, investing more time in my own health and wellness. So the plan created that sense of optimism, if you will. Let's think about insight number 4 then. And it's the idea that the words we use are changing. So many of the clients we talk to don't think about the end of full-time work as, you know, in quotes, retirement. So 40% of respondents said a different word resonated for that phase of their life. The next chapter was the most commonly used. And in fact, when we start digging in with younger clients, this was an even more extreme difference. They were thinking far more about the next chapter, far less about this word retirement. And these words may change, they may not be precise, but I do think it's telling us something important about how we think about that next chapter, if you will. And language, of course, matters. We also know that clients said they plan on retiring earlier. At least they hope to, and many will. So we would think of, obviously, the typical retirement age is in the mid-60s, but about a third of the clients that we talked to said they actually plan on retiring earlier than that, and in some cases, quite a bit earlier than that. So there is a shift to wanting something a little different. From there, we want, again, a lot of this research is just trying to go deeper and deeper and understand the thinking and the feelings behind some of the data. So we did ask those clients who said, I plan on retiring after 60, what might prevent them from doing that earlier, before the age of 60? Now, some simply said there aren't any barriers. Actually, it's not a financial concern. I want to keep working. There were some who pointed to concerns about finance, but more often than not, the responses were more about what am I going to do with my time, and will I feel, as I mentioned earlier, fulfilled with that? But we do certainly see this trend toward retiring earlier. And there are, again, some differences between the male and the female responses here. So when we look at that, women were a little more likely to point to concerns about financial resources. Men were more likely to provide what we might think of as more personal reasons. You know, what will I do with my time? Personal fears, worried about what others will think. There were a range, but we could put them under that category of personal reasons. So some clear differences there. And that takes us to the last insight before I turn back to Rob to chat about some of this. And I think it's an interesting one, because in this insight, what we tried to do, at least what led to the insight, was really take money off the table. And we asked, if you were financially able to stop working earlier, would you do it? Let's remove that as a barrier. And the answer is very clear. 62% said they would. And I think that tells us something about how people look at their options going forward. Differences, again, based on age. Our younger clients were considerably more likely to say that they would retire earlier if they could. Those who were older, again, were pretty much on a path at that point and perhaps had found a way to make it fulfilling. And so, I think that really takes us to hopefully a decent summary of those insights. So maybe, Remy, I can pass it back to you to lead us from here.
Thanks, Julie. And just a reminder too, you'll see a website on the top of that slide, savantwealth.com/retirement-study. So if you'd like to download a full copy of the full report, feel free to go to that website, copy that down, and then you can download it there. So thanks so much, Julie. And again, we have a few disclosures there for your viewing pleasure, and then we're going to move on to some questions. So Rob, let me just start with you. I think that first insight talks about our vision of retirement changing. And this is something that I think you've probably been seeing in your practice for quite some time. So what do you think is driving all that?
Well, I think in a nutshell, experience. This is not your father's or your grandfather's retirement. And I think there's a couple of big things. We talked about in the paper some of the evolution of retirement. And I think we have to remember this is still a relatively new concept. There's really only about 3 generations that have even experienced this concept of retirement. And in that, a lot has changed and continues to change, right? So, interestingly, when we first started to really introduce retirement was right about the time Social Security was launched, 1935. Life expectancy in 1935 was 60.7 years. Interestingly, wow. By the way, the benefits age was 65. So even the government in those days, they actuarially, they were not planning on this being a massive fund that it's become. So, and over the span since 1935, life expectancy has gone up by about 20 years. So we're pushing on 80 right now as the aggregate. So we're living longer and healthier lives. So we want to do more. So I think that's forcing that we're pushing the bounds of retirement and its concept. And we've also had enough experience to say, we'd like to do this differently. Think about the old concepts of and some of the terminology. The golden years. Living on a quote fixed income. I feel like those are increasingly dated terms and moving out of our lexicon. So I think that's just experience and evolution, and as we are a wealthier society, we're moving into that. By the way, if I happen to flinch, it's so perfectly timed right now that there is a window washer right here.
Of course there is. Of course there is.
I'm not under attack, I don't think. But the second thing I was just going to point out is I think we're increasingly managing our own affairs, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years. We're seeing this decoupling of work, of retirement funding, and with technology. So, the person used to, spend 30 to 40 years at their employer, get a gold watch, have a retirement party and move on. The average person now has 5 different careers, not just employers, but careers. Since the late 80s, companies are increasingly adopting 401k plans, saying we're pushing the responsibility and the saving on this as we move away from company funded pensions to 401k plans and the like. And so, we're increasingly like free agents, right? And responsible to manage this. And so as we've done that, again, we keep looking at this, I think, differently. And then the last couple of years are, really, I think, have been a catalyst and will continue to be technology. Here we are, the 3 of us and all of our friends on this Zoom call sitting in how many different states and countries, and yet we're able to do that. And that's only accelerated because of COVID. So I think all those factors, keep driving this and keep the evolution coming. I think we're still in the very early innings of it.
And I would just love to ask this question because I imagine, Rob, as you're talking to clients, you've seen this mindset shift, because I often think that I try to imagine myself going to my father and saying, yeah, I think I'm going to retire early and just do something I've always wanted to do. I think the man would have fallen off his chair at the idea. I mean, when did that start shifting in terms of the clients you talk to?
Well, I think it's, I would say my very first experience, I can think about this, where somebody did this on purpose, was 15 years ago. Clients come to me and said they wanted to take 2 years from their corporate job and go sailing the Caribbean and to Europe. And I thought that was a radical idea. My father actually was referred to him in the book I co-authored on Victory Lap retirements. My father did it in the 80s, but like most people, he went into consulting because he was, consolidated in a corporate setting. So I really only think in the last 5 to 10 years have people, to your point, Julie, kind of been willing to give up the security blanket of my company and are embracing this kind of free agency status. And I still think it's actually outside the norm. We find, and I think the study found that, I thought it was really powerful that 70% of people, if they knew how to go about it, would do something different.
Yeah.
But figuring out what that thing is and how I would do it is an impediment in and of itself.
Yeah.
We actually have some questions coming in here, so let me just go ahead and address the first one. As a 60-year-old person who has been working and investing with an eye toward retirement within a couple of years, I can say that this data is not surprising or alien. I agree. And I am living it as our peers, friends, et cetera. This is also a common topic that is discussed and written about broadly and often. And I guess that sort of brings us to the point of why did we actually go ahead and do this research? I mean, it's something that we're sort of seeing anecdotally, but Rob, maybe you could speak to that.
Well, I mean, so as a firm, we're an evidence-based, group of professionals. So, we're realizing that, values are shifting, priorities are shifting for people. And so we're thinking about, how do we adjust our approach? How can we better serve and help people achieve, what they want to do? And so, we did this study to, really to confirm a lot of our assumptions, my assumptions and observations more, anecdotally. We wanted to go, get some evidence of that and compare that. And we'll continue to do that because it just continues to evolve.
Yeah, and the same person asked, what does this trend and these shifts mean to Savant and how you work your strategies for customers, which is a great question and precisely why we did this.
Well, yeah, and so, I have started asking different questions over the years, and I think, we're going to continue to take this data and input and think about, really it starts with the planning process, right? I mean, it starts with a lot of people don't know what they don't know. So, exploring different possibilities, really, getting into what is it that you envision about your life? What would excite you beyond just this is a math equation, right? That we're solving for, financial independence, because that the math is going to be different, very different, depending on, what we envision. And that's one of the areas I think we haven't done enough in our profession, and people in general haven't done enough thinking about, what do I want my life to look like? So that I would say that's the first thing, that we're doing is starting to come at this different with different questions and go through the exercise more creatively, often with clients. The other is just sharing this information. We've been partnering with, and I think we'll continue to look to do that, partner with other outside resources. My co-author, from the Victory Lap Retirement book, Mike Drack, he's kind of a thought pioneer in retirement lifestyle. We've got him coming up in a webinar. We had him do one. Scott Fulton, who's an expert on longevity and aging. So I think we're going to look to continue to unearth this information and share it, and then, to be determined exactly how we'll work it into our services. But we're actively, testing, kind of retirement readiness processes and planning platforms and working on that, and excited to launch those as they're ready.
And we might mention too that this is sort of phase one of our research process. And Julie, I understand you're back in the field now, actually talking to Savant clients with the same kind of retirement information.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it becomes a true point of discussion at that point with your clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think probably the next step is comparing those to the general investing public, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then really determining what that means for Savant and how we work with clients afterwards. Julie, let me just move on to you.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody talks about the pandemic, and there were people who were furloughed and who actually got a taste of retirement before maybe they planned to, because they were downsized or furloughed or something like that. And, what do you think people learned about themselves during the pandemic?
I mean, it has been a fascinating time from that perspective. There were some who, as you say, actually became retired earlier than planned, but there were also some who were working from home and who weren't, their jobs hadn't changed, but they were all of a sudden getting a very different glimpse of what life would be like. And so it almost feels like there's a perfect storm at the moment of questions that are emerging. Now that I've experienced working from home, for example, for 18 months, or not working at all and not expecting that, how do I feel about what life looks like? And I think the other point, though, and it's an important point, is that, look, this last 18 months has challenged us in so many ways, and it has caused so many people, and we saw this in the data, to really say, what's important to me? How do I want to spend my time? How do I think about my future differently? And so it was, as I said earlier, it was less about the money changes. It was more about how do I want to spend my time? And so now we've got both of these things almost coming together at the same time. And it's creating some big questions in our mind. And that's where I think guidance starts to become so important, of course. And I don't know if everyone loves what they experienced at home. So it's probably a pretty good dry run to say, Rob maybe leading that charge. That's right. Right. So, interesting that we've had this time to consider that.
Yeah, and go ahead. I want to say on top of that, I couldn't agree more, Julie. And yeah, I'm definitely one of those people that, as you can see, I'm in the office and delighted to be so. Hopefully staying for some time, although we'll see. But I think what's been interesting is that COVID, it's this break in the norm, right? And I don't know that we would. I mean, it was an accelerant on this idea of working remotely. And I can't tell you the number of conversations we've had with clients where, they're going through this exercise and saying, wow, I could really repackage, what I do in this, or I've had the white space to think, here's what I'd really like to do. And because I'm not going in with my colleagues and in the office every day, it's given me the opening, the exit ramp to maybe do something sooner, or see if I can come at this on a consulting basis, or shift gears in some way. I think it would have been years or maybe never that we would have gotten quite to the point that we're at. But I agree, it's this confluence that's happened just of late.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we all saw things anecdotally, but pandemic was definitely a catalyst.
Yeah.
To accelerate this. So a couple more questions from our attendees. One is, your study pool includes folks with a net worth of 500,000 to 5 million. That's a really high range. Should the folks at the lower end of this spectrum consider retirement readiness differently? And if so, how? What differences do you suggest to your clients? It's a good question. Rob, you want to take that?
Right. So yeah, it's the answer is it depends. Right. So it's relative to it depends on your asset range, your sources of income, and your lifestyle expenses. So, all of those things in context, you really, I encourage people, you need to do some kind of base financial planning, to understand where you stand relative to where you'd like to get to, and how you define financial independence and how you define your ideal, future, your ideal lifestyle. So it could be that at 350,000, that there's an opportunity to do this, and the levers that you would pull might be identical to somebody with several million.
I can just note on that as well. One of the questions we asked of this particular group was, what would have to happen to retire earlier? And some pointed to making sure the primary residence was paid off as sort of an economic catalyst, but actually the number one thing that they pointed to was that they would have to have a clear vision for their life in retirement. That was 55%, and it was actually 20% higher than any other response. So, and I think what you're saying is that's true at varying different economic levels. One creates more options, but the thought process is probably largely the same.
That's a very good point. We have another question. With the possibility of living to 100, the need for earned income in retirement becomes more important in addition to income from investments and retirement plans. Are you thinking about advising people to develop a second gig earlier in their lives, which then becomes a primary source in the next chapter? That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I love that question, and I guess the short answer is yes, and I think where it makes sense. What we're definitely thinking about and working on is developing an assessment. So depending on your skill set, your profession, or what you'd like to move into, that might be a multi-year process. I have a good friend of mine who was a marketing executive for a global food company that you'd all know, and he switched into teaching, but he had to cut his teeth and teach at the community college for a few years to prove this out. He had to get permission from his employer to do some moonlighting. That may not be for everybody, but you definitely want to look before you leap with that kind of stuff. And so, we're very careful in talking with people about how they go about it. But, my observation with clients has been, often with our careers and our families and lives, we're not putting the time in to research that and to think about, okay, what would I do? How would I repackage this? Or what would I really like to do? Would I want to be a fishing boat charter captain? Do I want to give tours at the museum? What would my ideal be? And then investigate how you would shift over to that, if that makes sense for you. But I'm a big fan of, on the financial planning side, having residual income has a number of positive outcomes to it. It takes pressure off of portfolio withdrawals, and to the questioner's point, as we're looking to extend lifespan, the more we can lower distribution rates from portfolios and our dependency on markets, if we go through, as we know we will, market cycles. If we have even just a small amount of income, maybe we defer taking Social Security benefits until, age 70 and maximize benefits that way. So there's a lot of, really creative ways that we can plan around that, if that's an option for somebody and they're interested in doing it. And we find, what I actually find often is not only are they willing to do it, but they actually do it and they continue doing it for longer than we planned. Because if they truly do fall into something that is purpose built, or that they just simply enjoy it, why would you ever stop doing it at the end of the day? And you get paid to boot.
Exactly. It's interesting. An author that I really enjoy reading about, she talks about portfolio careers and having various sources of income coming in at the same time, so that if something were to happen to one of those sources, you wouldn't be in such a dire situation. You'd have those other ones to fall back on. And it's a little bit like that in retirement anyway. If you assume that you've got possibly Social Security, possibly a 401k you're drawing down on, other investments, that kind of stuff, adding another gig in retirement is just adding to that portfolio, I guess.
It's another, or the other way to think about it is it's another leg of the stool, right? You've got your your savings, your assets, which you can draw on. You've got pensions and Social Security, or maybe rental income, and then if we have a third leg in that stool, we're even more stabilized.
Exactly.
And I was really struck by the number of different paths that were identified, right? Just to your point, that it was some just doing part-time, it was some saying I want to do something completely different, some saying I want to do the same thing on my own terms. And then there was this group who said either, like you said, Rob, it was a hobby or it was something that aligned with some deeply held purpose that I've never really felt I could finally pursue. And people had very different views on when that would start, right? How far in advance. There were some who were maybe more risk averse, who said a year or two before, and others who said, no, I want to start doing this 4, 5, 6 or more years ahead of. So there's no average when it comes to this, which I think comes back to the idea of needing your own plan.
Well, it's part of what makes it, for me, exciting and fun is it is a truly creative process and very much individual. I find, there's a lot of people in that sort of passion hobby group. And then there's a lot of people who say, you know what, I actually like what I do. I just love to do it more on my own terms. I'm a professional, I'm a lawyer, I'm an accountant, I'm a doctor. I'd love to just do this, in my own way, on my own hours. One of my favorite clients many years ago, he was in his 80s and he was still working when I first met him. And he showed me his business card and it said his name, and then it said underneath his name, T to T, the number 2 and T. And I said, what's T to T? And he said, you don't know what that means? He said, Tuesday to Thursday, 10 to 2. That's my schedule.
I love it.
So that may be what a lot of people, they say, hey, what I do, I like just fine. I'd love to do it less.
What surprised me, just in looking at the survey results, was that high number of people who had a false start retirement. Julie, maybe you can talk about what's sort of happening there.
Yeah, I was quite surprised by that as well. I don't think Rob was because he talks to people all the time about this. So, it was, but the fact that the percentage was so high, and really it's living proof of what we're talking about, that we had people who went down this path and then discovered they didn't have as clear a plan or weren't feeling fulfilled. But my mind just went to how big a deal that is, right? When you think of someone who's telling everybody their retirement, talking to their family, having the party at work, whatever is involved, and then getting probably that niggling sense of, something's just not quite right. And I'm going to read so far into the data, but what I saw was just these stories of really courage, in a way, of people who said, I was going down this path, but I need something different. And to me, that's the best part of it, is they actually made a change and said, I'm going to go back to the workplace, rather than just saying, well, this is my lot in life. I've got the watch, I can't return it, so I'm just going to keep going.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys remember, there was a Jack Nicholson movie about 20 years ago called About Schmidt.
Oh yeah.
And it was kind of a dark comedy, and it starts with him, he's an actuary, and he's getting ready to retire. And like so many, he got the retirement party and the watch, and then things changed, and he wasn't ready, for that shift in his persona. And my wife's uncle, I used to kid him as he was a serial retirer. I think he retired 3 times before it finally took. But it just goes back to this idea that if we haven't put the time and energy into creating, proper vision of what we want life to look like, what are we going to use with this opportunity? It doesn't just show up, on its own.
You, in one of our conversations earlier, Rob, you mentioned this line of, what are you retiring to? Which I thought was such a great way to put it. Is that, I imagine that triggers a lot of different kind of conversations when you think about it in that context.
Yeah, I think we all tend to be, as a default, geared to, I'm retiring from my job, my career, the daily grind, instead of thinking about what is it that I'm creating, what am I retiring to? And so, I think we need to do a better job of, thinking about what is that? What is, I thought the study was absolutely crystal clear again that we need purpose, right? And we need a sense of fulfillment. And we get that from, there's a lot of places that can come from. It can come from your family. It can come from, a hobby, from, going back and starting something new. It could come from a community that you're a part of. A lot of places that can come from. But if we haven't thought through that, and by the way, we haven't thought through that if we have a partner, on the journey with us together and agreed on that, there's a concept called gray divorce, and one of the reasons I think we see lots of divorce in retirement is two things. People have different ideas of what life should look like. One of them wants to sit on the couch and one of them wants to be out, in the world, for example, or that they just haven't done a good job of preparing. And so, they experience, my co-author called this the retirement dip, that you have this kind of initial euphoria and then, you can actually go into something of a depressive state after the dust settles and all the hoopla is over. So if you haven't, anticipated and talked through that with your family, your significant other, I think it sets up, that's where we see higher instances of alcoholism as well. Not to get on a negative track here, but it's critically important. And I think frankly, one of the easier parts of this is the math, is doing the math. The harder part is figuring out what we want. What should that look like? What's it going to cost us? What kind of optionality do we have? One of the sayings I've used for years in financial planning in general is that, most people spend more time planning their summer vacation, their winter vacation than they do their life. And I find that to be true almost unanimously. And so we just can't, spend enough time on this and thinking about working on what do we really want this lifestyle to be, and what's the opportunity. There's an opportunity to reinvent yourself if you'd like.
And I can tell you, as an employer, this idea excited me quite a lot because immediately I was thinking, wow, there could be a broader access to incredibly experienced people who might not want to work full time or who have a different vision. And I just have to believe that some employers, if they're anything like us, would be thrilled at that notion.
I'm guessing we're seeing that. I mean, you look at the proliferation of contract work and consulting, and particularly with the baby boomers set, there's a mass exodus from corporate America happening. And so being willing to be flexible about how we package work, how we compensate, and the terms upon which we allow people to be a team member, I think, I don't know that there's a choice, frankly.
We just had a comment here from someone who says, I'm 50 and this year I left my corporate job. As you said, the math is easier and pivoting is a lot harder.
Case
I can
in
imagine.
point.
Exactly. We see so many examples of that.
We've done some seminars in the past, back when we could be in person, and on the Victory Lap Retirement book. And my co-author wrote much of the lifestyle stuff and I wrote much of the financial stuff. I can tell you he was much more important and popular in those talks than I was.
Interesting. But what we haven't talked about is really the implications for, the entire retirement system. Because if you think about it in the US, people expect to retire somewhere in their mid 60s. That's sort of general consensus. And so this seems to have implications for employers in the way that Julie said, but also, I mean, we're in the middle of a labor shortage right now. People say they can't get help. So maybe it's, time to think about it differently. But then also the way our retirement products are structured. I mean, we have 401ks and we have IRAs and everything is about, you get a penalty if you take out money too early, or, you have a required minimum distribution at some point. How do we need to rethink that?
Well, I wish I had the answer to all of that. I think we need to rethink it. That's where we're at. or at least it needs to evolve. So again, we're stretching retirement on both ends. We're living on average 20 years longer. We'd love to start this process sooner. So the lines of, kind of work and retirement are blurring. That's really good news, right? Again, I mentioned earlier, back in the day, we'd operate from this paradigm of I retire and then I go on a quote fixed income. Now the big challenge is how do we manage longevity? I've said for the whole of my career that, it's on average a 2-person 30-year retirement. Well, now it's 40, maybe we'll be approaching 50 as life expectancy keeps, getting stretched out. So we're going to need to evolve the way that we think about this stuff. I think there's a couple of practical things people can do individually. Having assets outside of retirement accounts, increasingly important if you're going to retire before full retirement age. So, beginning to accumulate. Sorry, this is bad news for those of you that just popped the champagne because you got your mortgage paid off and your kids off to college and you thought, all I have to do now is my 401k. But the truth is you probably want to be bolstering to the degree that you can, non-retirement accounts, developing that residual income strategy, for yourself. So those are things you can do, and I encourage people to do. But, we're also seeing some experimental products, I'd say, in industry around the other end, longevity. In the last 10 years, one of the bigger new products has been reverse mortgages.
Mm-hmm.
I think the jury's still out on that, but because most people's biggest asset is their home, that's a potential product solution. Now, like most new products, it's probably a bit expensive now, doesn't make sense in a lot of cases. And so I have yet to actually recommend a client do it. But I mean, that's the kind of thinking, longevity annuities, where I could buy some annuities that I know I'm not going to use. It's a hedge against my own longevity. And maybe I don't, have those until I'm in my 80s, my spouse or I. So, I mean, President Biden has floated the idea of backing Medicare age from 65 to 60. That would probably be the biggest thing I can imagine. I mean, the biggest barrier to people retiring prior to 65 in the United States, bar none, is healthcare. What are you going to do about health insurance? So that would be, I think, a potential game changer for people. So we'll have to see, and I think we need to try to obviously continue to influence. And there needs to be a good feedback loop from, our clients, firms like Savant, and the powers that be, create those products and legislate them.
And one of our attendees agrees with you. He says if people were eligible for Medicare at age 60, it would be even easier since health insurance is so expensive on your own. And it's also expensive for employers to, if you're offering benefits to older workers, health insurance can be expensive too. So it's a kind of a difficult situation that has to be creatively managed, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's for sure. And obviously we've been working at this for some time, and, we can't say we've arrived at any success yet. I mean, it works well when you have a couple and one spouse is continuing to work and wants to continue to work. And then, part of their employment can be to get the health insurance benefits. Or if somebody's going to be underemployed, right, they're going to go from the corporate suite to, be the proverbial greeter at Bass Pro Shops or something like that. But they, maybe they'll accept lower pay in exchange if they can get, health insurance or other benefits. So there's a few strategies, people can employ, but it would sure be nice if there was a better system for it. So hopefully that evolves.
Just a reminder, folks, if you have a question that you'd like to submit, you can go ahead and use that Q&A icon down in your toolbar and feel free to type it in, and we'll try to get it in here before we wrap up today. I love the idea that people are thinking even about the word retirement differently. I know, Julie, you sort of threw out a few terms there and let people choose from each one. What do you think that's saying?
Well, to me, it says a couple of things. To me, it's a very optimistic trend that the words we have used in the past perhaps didn't reflect how we're feeling now. And I think we do associate the term retirement, even though we're all using it right now, as an end of something. Whereas this idea of the next chapter or the third phase or the encore or whatever, they all say the same thing. They say things haven't stopped and they're just going to look different. But I think that has just interesting implications because it's almost like our language is changing. And you really see this with the younger respondents, right? So if we sat down with someone who was 40 and said, we really need to think about your retirement, you might get a, really? and not because it's so far away, simply because they're not thinking of it in that term. So I'm quite fascinated to see what happens in the next 5 years and 10 years. I think if we sat down a decade from now, we'd be looking back and saying, wow, that completely changed. So I just see it as a healthy, optimistic, kind of hopeful way of thinking about the future.
Absolutely. And, Rob, I don't know, if you've been in situations with younger clients who it's really hard to get them to focus maybe on retirement or what is the next chapter.
Yeah, I think it's hard when you're starting out in your career to relate to this big-headed goal, 30 to 40 years out. So I find it's actually not effective to orient younger clients quite as much around that. There's a lot of hurdles they often have between where we are today and what might be their retirement. They're, at the beginning point of just shoring up their financials. And actually, I've had a number of conversations where I think younger folks these days are recognizing and seeing some of the positives and negatives of traditional retirement, thinking, you know what, I want to invest myself more in finding the work that I do, even if I didn't get paid. That the analogy of, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. I mean, I've had a lot of 20 and 30 somethings talk to me about, wouldn't it be smarter to do that now? Say, well, absolutely. Before you get the mortgage and other things that require you to maximize your income, that would be really good. And then you never have to retire.
All right, we've got a flurry of questions coming in now. One is, if the language is changing, will federal guidance eventually change too, i.e. non-penalty on early withdrawals? I have a shortened life expectancy and want to be able to retire early pre-55. Interesting. And, I certainly think it's up for discussion.
Yeah, I mean, again, let's hope. I think that's where hopefully the feedback loop works. It certainly should. The language and the regulation should change, and there should be more optionality. I think there's indication to be optimistic. If you look at what happened, last year in the midst of the COVID crisis, the regulations changed, pretty quickly. Now, do we need a crisis for some of this to change? Hopefully not. But clearly this stuff is not set in stone and the rules continue to evolve. So we need to continue to lobby our constituent, our legislators, and hope that they take that and put it into work.
Absolutely. We had a comment here from one attendee, says, being a worker and producing is so culturally valued. I struggle to understand how I view myself after I am no longer a worker. And boy, I get that.
I think that's, said, and we can't discount all of the concerns and worry about health, right? I mean, it's come up a number of times, but if we set that aside, I think that really gets to the heart of what so many people say. And it feels as if we're moving into a time where we're testing some of these assumptions, as we have done as a population with many things over time. It's a period of real introspection, I think, for more so for some than others who feel those things deeply. Depends on how you were brought up and what you were taught. But I think we're changing what the definition of what it means to be a worker. So it may not be an easy road, but to me, this is just a fascinating time to, it doesn't hurt to ask the questions, right? to really think about, and that's where it all starts.
Maybe one of the surprises that comes out of this is the fact that we actually have options.
Yeah.
I think the expectation for a lot of people, including myself at some point, was, okay, you go to school, then you join the workforce and you work until a certain age, and then you're saving that whole time, and it doesn't have to be linear like that anymore. And I guess it's kind of like, oh, I have options. What do you mean?
And that's a big deal. I often use my poor husband as an example in these things, but we have these almost hysterical conversations where he says, what do you think we'll do in retirement? And he looks at me as if like I've never thought about that. I mean, I'll figure it out when I get there. I don't know, right? But that is quite literally how he was raised to think about things. So, to Rob's point about couples coming together, I think it's an interesting conversation. But yeah, we just haven't thought about it.
Right.
I think of dashboard time. When I'm driving, my wife and I, she rolls her eyes because I always ask those questions because we have nowhere to go. We're captive.
Yeah, you can't leave me now. We're gonna.
Yeah, you're stuck. You're stuck with me for the next 2 hours. Let's talk about this. But what's funny is we've made a lot of progress over the years from those conversations. Exactly. The other, I want to just comment on this idea of transition from worker. I mean, this is identity based, right? I mean, that's why there's so much importance in my mind and observation around carving. What is my identity going to be? How am I going to define myself? What am I going to do with, I mean, a lot of people don't think about how am I going to spend my time? Like, what's my schedule going to be? And some of it is beginning to take baby steps around things like that, and then obviously learning as you go. But it's a massive shift.
Exactly. We have a couple of just last comment and a question around healthcare and retirement, which I know is a big concern. One person says, another legislative priority, Medicare for those living outside the US. There would be huge savings for the government and a freedom to continue to travel and learn in another culture for the next chapter. So that's one thing. And then another one says, to me, retiring early, pre-65, is all about health benefits, how to get them at lower than COBRA costs. This person says, I think professional association, maybe AARP, should offer group health benefits. Do you have any inputs on this?
Yeah, that was proposed within the last 5 years, that we open up to groups, associations, to come together. And there's some of that's been happening on the retirement plan side. To allow small groups to come together, and there you could get some pricing advantage, because it's all about getting, to the number of lives, right, that we drive down the cost. So I keep watching for that and hoping that that's, begins to show up. I don't see where there'd be an opposition to that. I would think even the carriers would get behind that. I don't, I'm not a political expert, so I don't know, who would take the other side of that, but I hope that that's something that can evolve in time.
All right. Well, Rob and Julie, I want to thank you both for joining us today. We are at an hour, and I think in webinar time, an hour is about as much as people can take. So we're going to wrap it up here. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. A couple of really quick reminders. One is, if you'd like to read the full report, go to our website, https://savantwealth.com/retirement-study. And there you can find our complete report on this. And then also just a reminder that when we wrap up here, you will receive a survey that pops up in your browser, and we would sure appreciate your feedback. That will help us refine our ability to offer you high quality content. So with that, Rob, Julie, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.